Hello, and welcome to Creating Gender Inclusive Camps. My name is Joel Baum, and I'm the Senior Director for Professional Development here at Gender Spectrum. We're excited today to talk to you about different ways that camp environments can be made inclusive for all young people, regardless of their gender. Gender Spectrum is an organization whose mission is to create a gender-inclusive world for all kids. The way we do that is to engage others in conversations about gender, changing notions, the ways in which young people are really thinking about gender, and then ask those professionals and other adults to consider the implications for the work they do with those young people. We do that work in a number of different ways through active participation in an ongoing conversation about gender, through direct services to families and other caregivers. We hold some gender spectrum events, both locally here in the California Bay Area, as well as supporting other organizations across the country, and in particular through our professional development programs, which support education as well as other institutions to think about their practices and the degree to which they are in fact incorporating gender inclusive concepts. I want to say a couple things about the platform we're using. If you want to participate, you will notice in the upper left-hand corner a bar that includes a Q&A section. If you click on that, that will give you a window in which you can go ahead and write your question, and then it will appear once you hit return or send. A couple other notes. All of your microphones are muted. This is not a webinar where you're able to communicate back and forth audibly. This session, however, is being recorded. And so in case you do run into any technical difficulties, please know that the session will be recorded and available both on the Gender Spectrum website, as well as being posted on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/genderspectrum. Today, we're going to be doing a couple different things. We're going to briefly do an overview, very, very cursory, about dimensions of gender and what gender diversity is. We will then talk specifically about some specifics and characteristics of gender-inclusive camp practices, followed by a robust Q&A, including using the questions that many of you submitted prior to today's session. So let's begin by talking just a little bit about gender literacy, this idea of being able to discuss and understand gender. We use a model to talk about gender that's called the dimensions of gender. Now, right there's an important concept, which is that gender has multiple dimensions. In particular, a person's gender experience is really informed by three different aspects: their body, their expression, and their identity. And it's the intersection of these three dimensions which really leads to this experience that we call gender. Each of those dimensions is a spectrum. That is, rather than a simple binary of typically of male or female only for each one of those, there's a broad range of possibilities. For instance, in the body, yes, there are typically male and typically female bodies. There's, first of all, an incredible diversity within those typical morphologies, but also there are bodies that are not typically male or female that maybe make up to 2% of live births that result in bodies that are neither typically male nor female. So too with expression. While there are ways that society often says boys or girls should be expressing themselves or showing their gender, in fact, expression exists on a continuum that is changing all the time, also across cultures, and from location to location. And finally, identity. Identity is the internally held sense of self, where once again, while many people may identify as a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, some people don't, and they'll identify as non-binary or gender fluid or somewhere else beyond the binary notions of gender that predominate in our society. Also, important to recognize that gender and sexual orientation are not the same thing. Sexual orientation is about our attractions to other people who we're drawn to physically or romantically. It is in part based, of course, on the gender of the other person, but it's not the same thing as my gender. My gender is personal. It's about me, who I know myself to be, as well as the way I express that, the body I'm born with, and all the ways I put those dimensions together for me personally. Sexual orientation is interpersonal. It's about me in relationship to another person. Again, this is just a very brief overview of gender diversity and gender literacy. If this is something you're interested in learning more about, please visit our website, and we also offer a wide range of trainings and other services to help you in that way. So now let's talk about gender-inclusive camps. Just what are they? Well, I want to first name some principles to keep in mind as you think about moving towards greater gender inclusion. And that begins with your own mission and vision. What are the beliefs and values that undergird your camp about things like inclusion and making sure every child is able to be their full selves and find their potential and reach their potential and figure out who they are in your space? Gender inclusiveness is not about certain kids, but impacts every young person, as gender is something all kids have and grapple with on a regular basis. I want to encourage you to think about fire prevention versus putting out fires. In other words, you can create conditions that will allow many of the questions that were asked about certain campers to be answered in a very proactive way. Or you can wait till certain situations arrive and try to deal with them one at a time. But as we talk today, you're going to see it's about creating conditions, which of course takes a little time on the way to creating the inclusive camp. I also want to remind you that you are already experts in this work because you work with young people and support individual kids and their needs all the time. Don't forget that. You know how to help young people figure out how to be successful in your camp and to work with the other campers based on the individual camper's uniqueness, the ways in which they're different from other campers. This is the work you do every day. And I want to remind you that Rome wasn't built in a day. Creating a gender-inclusive camp takes time. And today we'll be spending about an hour talking about some ways to move towards that. Fortunately, it's January, and many of you will be starting camps in the spring or summer. And so you have time now to implement some of the practices we're going to talk about. Why are camps such a great place for gender inclusion? Well, as stated here in the Journal of Park and Recreation Administration, the camp experience is often the first real experience in which a child has an opportunity to explore new realities. Camps offer an incredible chance for young people to try on and figure out who they are, to put themselves in situations with new people in ways that may be new for them, and therefore ways in which they can stretch and try out different ideas and ways of being with people outside their regular circles. The camp environment, in fact, is a highly flexible space that allows for lots of different ways of being. Yet it is also a space that has very high standards and expectations, as well as opportunities to provide training and build the capacity of camp leaders and camp staff to understand these ideas. In addition, the relationships that exist in a camp are also uniquely suited for creating greater gender inclusiveness. First of all, in many cases, young people have the opportunity to reinvent themselves and be supported by the adults in the camp to do that and really be authentic. They're surrounded generally by caring adults who are developing very specific kinds of relationships that are different from that of teachers or other individuals that kids are with, including their parents. And please know, camps can often be a respite from other environments in which young people maybe were not as successful or were not treated as respectfully. And they often are seeking that respite in the camps they're attending to be safe, to be seen, and to be supported. What is a gender-inclusive camp? Well, really, these are spaces in which everything about the camp asks the question, to what extent are we accounting for the gender of all of our campers? They then take very specific steps to make sure that every camper can assert their gender, can bring their full selves to the space, and that in doing so, they won't be mistreated. They won't face discrimination or harassment. And that's what a gender-inclusive camp strives to be. And the way they do that, well, some of those ideas are listed here. They recognize that gender does impact all young people and avoid reinforcing stereotypical binary notions. They celebrate gender diversity and model it. They question gender stereotypes that they encounter. They support campers to explore all parts of identity and who they are, including their gender. And on an ongoing basis, they're teaching empathy and respect. One of the documents that we've developed over the year in collaboration with many of our colleagues out there in the camp world is this framework for gender-inclusive camps. It includes some of the ideas that we've spoken about, as well as a specific framework of different entry points or ways in which you can focus this work and manage it. For example, one area is to look at what are the personal understandings of gender that exist in your professional community. The personal understanding work involves helping staff understand gender, reflect on their own gender, and in fact, think about how do those experiences and notions impact the work they're doing with young people. Practices in this area include providing training for your staff to allow them to understand and honor gender, to provide written materials and other information about gender diversity and that have it ready for staff and families, and to consider hiring gender diverse staff that will model for the entire community all the different ways that a young person might encounter gender and want to express and identify their gender. A second area that can build gender inclusiveness is the organizational structure of the camp. The organizational structures are those conditions that create the foundation for gender inclusion to take hold. What steps can you take to recognize and honor gender diversity in a way that doesn't wait for it to confront you, but in fact shows up in the encounters you have with the world? And how can you work to reflect this more complex understanding? Well, one thing you can do is create policies and regulations that do in fact name gender as an area that you are paying attention to and tie those to your camp's mission. For example, even statements such as, we do not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, disability, gender identity, or gender expression are ways in which you can operationally demonstrate this understanding. In addition, we're going to talk about gender support plans. Gender support plans are very specific tools for camps to work with transgender, other gender-expansive young people. In other words, for any camper for whom gender is on the table, we want to encourage you to use a gender support plan. This is designed to make very, very transparent the agreements and needs of that individual camper. Campers have a wide range of needs when it comes to their gender, and this support plan, rather than leaving that to chance, helps identify each of those. It's broken up into a number of different parts, as you can see here, beginning with confidentiality, and that's going to be one of the key questions for you to address with that young person and their family. The fact of the matter is, this is unique for every kid. Some kids are completely open about their gender identity and status, perhaps proud to assert their transgender identity or to claim their non-binary status through the use of pronouns such as they and them. Others will want to maintain absolute privacy. Perhaps they're coming to your camp for the very, very first time, and this is an opportunity for them to live authentically in their true gender. In other cases, of course, you'll have some young people who've been part of your community and are now coming back to camp perhaps as a different gender. While that is maybe not a private situation, in other words, other campers know this young person, that doesn't mean they don't have confidentiality needs, that they can't be respected, and that their privacy needs to also be recognized. It's not up to the camp, for instance, to share that with everyone. The gender support plan also looks at other areas, from how we're going to ensure safety, what names and pronouns, and how we're going to do camp records, use of facilities, how to look at programs, and a number of other considerations. But the gender support plan is one of the key tools that should be in your arsenal for working with these campers. Other practices include using record-keeping systems that allow families to tell you their child's gender, their name, and the pronouns they wish to use. This is an important question to consider asking all of your applicants, because that way you're not only signaling to the kids who particularly need to tell you, oh, my name isn't what's on that birth certificate, but also to every one of your community members that you're accounting for gender. You make sure you have a staff member who is clearly functioning as the lead around these kinds of efforts. And when you have the opportunity, consider providing all gender restrooms or facilities that allow options for privacy that don't carry a stigma with them. And of course, that's going to depend on your physical plant and other issues, but when you're able to, that's another organizational practice that conveys gender understanding of gender diversity. Another way in which you can move towards greater gender inclusion as a camp is to consider the language and messages that are being conveyed about your organization's understandings of gender. Using gender inclusive language helps demonstrate your commitment to these ideas. And you want to think about all the different interactions and conversations that can be used to reinforce this commitment to gender inclusion. Again, consider training staff, including role-playing and practicing intervening when they encounter gender stereotypes or discrimination. Consider using signage and other imagery that celebrates gender diversity just as a standard part of the camp environment. Whether you're creating forms or flyers or other materials, try to do so in a way that demonstrates a non-binary understanding of gender. If you're using images, make sure that they include a wide range of ways in which gender might be portrayed. Consider language that says things like cisgender or all gender or non-binary or other ways that conveys a vocabulary of gender. Now, of course, that requires some training, and that's why this work takes some time. And consider analyzing all of your communications, your website, your social media, and any other external communications, and examine the degree to which they are either promoting a completely binary, restrictive idea about gender or a more open, inclusive idea. And then the last area, of course, that you can focus on are the specific activities that you use at your camp in order to, again, further promote gender diversity. These are specific ways that you are investing in the camp's time, your most valuable resource, in a way that says gender diversity is something we pay attention to. Some things you might do in this area is try to avoid dividing campers into groups based on gender. Consider using the arts as a way to explore gender, or using gender as a topic for other forms of expression. Create spaces in which campers can articulate their own understandings and beliefs about gender, as well, including their own, and ways in which they can communicate that. If your camp includes academics, integrate gender into some of the curriculum areas through various ways, whether it's story problems, writing prompts, or other ways of making gender present in those opportunities. Now, those are just some of the general practices. What I want to turn to next are some of the questions that you submitted prior to today's webinar, and then we'll see if we're also able to get to some of the ones coming in today, but hopefully some of the ones we're going to look at next will be those that are coming in now. One area of questions that we've received are about gender support plans, or specifically meeting the needs of gender diverse young people. So who do we share inclusive plans with? I'm thinking support staff, dining staff, etc. What's the best way for requesting this kind of information? What do we do when a camper transitions to a new gender but wants to return to a camp, and where on the website is the inclusive plan? Well, let's begin by simply talking about who we share the plan with. That will in part be answered specifically in the development of the gender support plan. In some cases, staff will, the family and young person will specifically want that shared with all the adults that young person is encountering. Perhaps the young person is even completely transparent in public about their gender, in which case they say share that with anyone. More often, you're going to have families and young people saying, listen, it's okay if my counselor knows, it's okay if the head of the camp knows, maybe the medical staff might need to know, but otherwise we don't want everyone else to know, because we don't want to see that child as the transgender kid, but rather simply as just another kid. The gender support plan is a way to specifically identify who needs to know. Also, What's the best way for requesting this information? Well, that is why, in fact, we have the Gender Support Plan as a way to formally convey to families, we are on top of this. It not only allows you to get that information, but demonstrates a level of readiness so that when a parent approaches you with their kid and has questions about their gender, they're going to be quite nervous in many cases. When you say, oh, that's great, let's go ahead and set up a time to discuss a gender support plan, that demonstrates that you're already thinking about this and will provide a great deal of confidence to those parents. When a young person transitions to a new gender but wants to return to camp, we're an inclusive all-girls camp. How do we handle that situation? Well, once more, the Gender Support Plan is a great way to look at these very specific situations. It may very well be that as part of your philosophy, you recognize the levels of gender diversity that are out there and will be able to work with your camp and camp community and determine, is this still a great place for this particular kid to be? We've done work with a number of single-sex spaces, whether it's organizations like the Girl Scouts or the YWCA, girls or boys schools, and in many cases, the process of addressing this question, a member of the community who transitions to a new gender and whether or not they should stay or not, is an iterative process, back and forth. First of all, if you're an all-inclusive girls camp and the specific notions of that camp are about ways of being a girl and what it means to be a girl in today's society, then you want to work with that camper and determine, is this still going to be a good fit for you? Given that your identity has shifted in such a significant way, does the work that we're doing still apply to your experience? At the same time, do not underestimate the fact that your camp may be a space where this transition started to occur and in fact was a space where that young person could feel exceptionally safe. What I think you need to be able to convey is to anyone that might raise a concern about that is we are making sure that every member that attends our camp is being supported in the ways that make sense for them. And you don't have to answer to another family about any young person. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. But once again, the Gender Support Plan is your way of breaking down these larger questions and instead specifying for individual campers in individual situations what's going to be the very best way for approaching them. One of the things I love that the Girl Scouts shared was that their job is not to determine who is and isn't a girl, but that they will work with anyone that comes to them and says, my child's a girl and we want to be supported here. Depending on the individual's transition, that may apply in this case as well. In terms of finding the Gender Support Plan, if you go onto the Gender Spectrum website, you'll see a space that says resources on the upper band. And when you click on that, you'll see a section that says parenting and family. And clicking on that will lead you to this space. And on those resources for parents and families, you'll see a section called Camp Sports Leagues and Other Activities. And here's where you will find a great number of both the resources, including the Gender Support Plan. How do we work with the parents of transgender and non-binary campers? This was another question that came up quite a bit. For instance, if the parents are not aware of a camper's gender identity, how do you suggest using the Gender Support Plan? Or is it not the camp's place to initiate this specific support plan? What kind of communication with parents do you recommend in such cases? What to do when a camper tells you something about their gender identity, but they haven't talked to their parents? And what about resources? Well, let's talk about these situations when we don't necessarily have a parent or caregiver's support in place. What's important to recognize here is that many young people have wonderfully affirming families, and some do not. And some young people are, in fact, using the experience of camp to really assert this sense of self that they have in a way that they maybe have not been able to do so. Therefore, they need a very, very safe space to do so and may have very, very real concerns about sharing this information with their parents. They may be scared, they may have reason to believe that they will be thrown out, or there could even be physical implications. So when a young person comes to us and says, my parents aren't on board, it's critical that we first simply acknowledge, We get that your parents don't seem to be there yet, and we're understanding that. Now let's talk about that a little bit, because one of the things we know in research is from the research about health and wellness for transgender and other non-binary young people, parental affirmation is a critical element of ultimate health and well-being. While not a guarantee, we do know that when young people have the support of their families, they do better. We also know that for families to get there, it sometimes takes time. And so one thing to name for that camper is to say the word yet. In other words, your family's not on board, but maybe not yet. And that they might want to think about what it could look like for you to help get that family on board. Now, that may be beyond your charge, that may be beyond what the capacity you have, but by getting information and resources out there to families, you can help make that happen. But let's step back for a second to this individual camper. This is one of those places where you need to very seriously re-examine your mission, your vision for the kind of space that you are providing for a young person. If a young person is coming to your camp and asking to be supported in a way that affirms their gender, you need to think seriously about making sure you're doing that. Because if you don't, then that young person will not be able to experience your camp and they will not feel safe. Whether or not you choose to share that information with the parent really comes down to some of your individual beliefs and expectations for how you work with families. But I would encourage you to look at other situations where campers have shared perhaps private information and how you have handled that. But you need to take it very seriously when a young person tells you, this is who I am, I'm needing your support, and I'm not ready for my parents to know. Remember, camps can be that very, very safe space where kids can, in fact, try on new senses of self and what it feels like to experience those. At the same time, if you do choose to honor the young person's privacy and not share this information, you need to also be very real with that camper and help them understand that that doesn't mean their parents won't find out. Whether they're friends with other people at camp, whether it's through some other process, it's quite possible, maybe even photos that get shared on the page about the camp and they see the camper wearing different clothing or something, it's very possible that the family will in fact find out that the young person is being supported in this way. And you once again need to help that young person be prepared and have situations where you're ready for that. You need to have contingencies in place for dealing with that if it does come up. We recommend, though, that you follow the kids' cue on this. Young people have privacy rights as well, and we need to be very, very careful about violating those when it comes to this situation. Of course, another major area of consideration is facilities. How are we handling the various spaces in which young people are going to find themselves? Cabins, restrooms, showers, and such. Before getting too far into this, I want to encourage you to take a look at a document that we created called Transgender Students in School Bathrooms, Frequently Asked Questions. While this is grounded in the school space, which is different than camps, it has a great deal of information about ways in which to talk about this issue in a very reasonable way. It asks you to look at different questions that parents may ask or others may ask and to address them on a case-by-case basis, because in fact there are often assumptions being made about why a young person shouldn't be allowed in the bathroom, and we need to get underneath that. Well, what specifically are the concerns, and are those concerns about the transgender student, or are they other issues such as supervision and safety, and in fact something that applies to all young people? Coming back to your questions, how do we create more gender-inclusive cabins? Do we offer boy, girl, and co-ed cabins? Well, one of the underlying principles of gender-inclusive spaces is trying to have as much flexibility and options as possible. If you have the ability to offer spaces more than just simple boy-girl spaces, that is something to seriously consider. But to do so in a way that is grounded in very clear expectations that regardless of who is in a room with you, who's in your cabin or who's in your tent, there are certain ways to conduct yourself. And I want to encourage people to think about the concerns that may get raised about, say, a co-ed cabin. Those concerns actually exist as well in single-sex spaces. And in fact, you need to be much more clear, not about who are you with in your cabin, but in fact, how do you conduct yourself? What are our expectations for behavior, for respecting privacy, for observing personal boundaries and personal space, and simply what does it look like to be in these shared spaces together? You can do work around that that will benefit everyone in your camp, regardless of who their roommates are. In terms of bathrooms and showers, once again, if there are opportunities to provide private options for anyone who might need them, but have those options not be stigmatized, that's one way to handle this situation. But you must, again, be very clear about what your expectations are and how people conduct themselves in those spaces. What's really, really critical is that gender support plan will be the first place to start and find out where does the individual camper, in fact, even want to go. It may be that they will choose to use a private space simply for their own comfort. It also may be that they want to start in that space, but may want to begin using another space. Most of the bathrooms that campers are using will often have private stalls, in which case the young person you're working with has already been navigating many of the spaces that you're concerned about. In terms of shower use, again, providing alternative schedules, providing curtained areas or other privacy spaces. You want to look at how can we maximize the level of privacy for anyone that might use it. And what's important there is that that's not just about telling the transgender student, you must use the private space, but in fact saying to campers and families that may be really concerned about that, hey, if you're concerned about who's in the shower with your child for whatever reason, then we can offer you a private space. What we find is that young people are far less concerned and nervous about these spaces than the adults that are supporting them. So really what we're talking about is the importance of planning and having a very specific way of identifying where an individual camper wants to go or what facilities or cabins they'll use, having options that are not stigmatized whenever possible for anyone who might require additional privacy. And thirdly, being very clear about your expectations for how individuals are conducting themselves in those spaces. For instance, there might be a concern about, someone seeing another person's body in a way that's uncomfortable. Well, I would argue and encourage you to think that may be the case for any young person in those spaces. What are we communicating about modesty and expectations around that? What are we communicating that if a person is particularly shy or needs additional privacy, how do we respect that? So setting very clear expectations about how individuals conduct themselves in these spaces is way more important than the bodies of the individuals in those spaces, particularly if you've already made a commitment to naming that you respect the gender diversity of all the young people in your charge. There are also a number of questions about legal issues. I want to be very clear. I am not a lawyer. I'm not prepared to give you any legal advice. But the questions were, are you obligated by law to accept transgender campers? And what are the disclosure laws for children who are transgender? Again, not an attorney. Regarding the first question, I would ask you to consider the law should really be the last reason that you're being inclusive of transgender campers. If you're doing it simply because the law has told you you must, I would be concerned about the ability to create the inclusive space that camper and all campers would need. Specifically, what are the laws around that? I'm not in a position to talk about that. It's going to vary from state to state, but it's going to vary whether the camp is receiving federal dollars and such or state and county dollars in states and counties that have gender protections. But as I said, I would encourage you to speak with your own legal staff about that, but also to look more deeply at your own vision. about who you want to be and what kind of space you're trying to create for your campers. And as far as disclosure laws for children, once again, privacy is a very important concept in our society, and children also do have privacy rights, but the degree to which those apply will vary in state to state, and also with who you're talking about sharing that information. However, it's one thing to be vacillating about sharing private information with that child's family. It's a completely different thing when you think about sharing that private information with other families. And I would strongly encourage you to consider why, in fact, another family has a right to learn about very, very personal matters of any of your campers, and to think about issues other than gender in which you, of course, protect the privacy of other people. Or the privacy of your campers from other people. I'd like you to think about for a minute the issues of comfort versus safety. You will often hear families come to you and say, I'm concerned about my child's safety. Who's going to make sure they're safe? And if there's a transgender child there, how do I know my child is safe? Well, that's a good question for any child, and I would argue that you're accounting for the safety of all kids. But when it comes to specific safety related to a transgender young person, the person whose safety you need to most worry about is that transgender young person. They are by far in greater risk than those non-transgender young people. But that doesn't mean the other people aren't uncomfortable. And dealing with discomfort is different than dealing with safety. If someone's uncomfortable, then does that person need to compromise, or do you force the transgender person to compromise because others are uncomfortable with that person? And take it away from gender and consider another identifying aspect, whether it might be a person's race, or they might be differently abled, or someone of a different religion, or has different traditions and practices that they engage in as part of their culture. If a family were to say to you, I don't want that person in my cabin, I don't want that person to be able to stay with the regular campers, how would you respond to that? What would your stance be around equity inclusion for other aspects? And while gender is an area that's in some ways new for our society in the conversation, in many ways it is an equity issue very much like others, and in many cases is protected just like other aspects of identity. But again, I think you need to be very clear about consulting your legal counsel around these questions, but even more importantly, to ask yourself, is this really about a legal issue, or is this more about the values and beliefs of your camp? And what about those other campers and families, and how do we respond to them? What is the effect on other campers in the cabins of having a transgender young person? Well, in part, it may very well be that the other campers are going to have no idea if that person is private. Our transgender young people are navigating spaces throughout their lives in very, very various ways, and doing so in a way that protects their own privacy. So it may very well be that it'll have absolutely no effect on other campers. And similarly, this notion of dealing with roommates and the degree to which you feel like you need to tell a roommate about another person's very private information, we would encourage you to think very, very carefully about doing that and how you might go about doing that, because you really can violate that transgender person's privacy by sharing information that compromises even their safety. Once again, it's much more important to be talking about the conduct of being in rooms with one another. Now, if it's a camper who has been part of your community for a long time, and they're known to have transitioned, and it's a young person who maybe is other people are aware of, well, I think you need to once again ask yourself, what are your expectations around equity and respect for differences? And that if someone is uncomfortable, how do you account for perhaps creating options for that person that don't require isolating or stigmatizing the transgender camper? The gender support plan can be a great place as you identify who might be a good fit, who is that person already friends with, or perhaps has done overnights or sleepovers with, as might make sense for them to be their roommate as well. But you need to be very, very careful about what you reveal. And as I said, dealing with other campers, inquiries about the particular camper. Well, once more, if you've established conditions where talking about everyone's gender diversity and that gender is unique for each of us and that it's a private thing and this is how we ask or don't ask about another person's identity, if you're modeling respect for privacy, if you're making sure that it's clear that if someone doesn't want to share any private information, they don't have to, you can then demonstrate, hey, this is how we respond to personal questions of any kind. I would argue when it comes to talking about an individual camper, as we see in many schools, it would be inappropriate for you to talk about another camper with one of their peers or with parents of other campers, because now you're talking about another person's very private information, and you need to be very, very careful with that. Now, if in the gender support plan, one of the things you've talked about is how do you want the camp to respond to inquiries that may come, well, then you'll have some direction on how to handle that. Another question that came in related to staff. Where do we look for gender diverse staff without being tokenistic about it? Does that make sense? Well, one of the ways that you can be gender inclusive that we mentioned earlier is by having staff that represents the diversity of gender. There are a lot of different ways to advertise that you're seeking staff. One is to name, we are specifically looking for a diverse staff, including the following areas: race, language, gender, sexual orientation, whatever the diversity you're looking for, it's okay to name that. Specifically advertising in spaces where gender diverse young people may be. It may be that you're looking at various inclusion clubs on a college campus or LGBT centers. You may want to think about advertising in various publications or online in spaces that are focused on gender and gender diversity. There are lots of them out there. If you have already some gender diverse staff, talk to them about what are some ways to reach out and reach people of all forms of gender diversity. But you can do this without being tokenistic, just as you can do it with other forms of diversity. What about addressing parents' concerns regarding gender fluid cabin counselors? Is that the right term? Well, it might be. With much of the terminology, it really is a matter of what a person wants to use to label themselves, but that certainly can be one. Here I once again would ask you to consider any concerns that come up about any of your counselors. The role of cabin counselors is to create a very safe space, to supervise that space, and to be looking out for the welfare of the kids. That is not going to change based on the counselor's body. I would assume that you have very high expectations for all your staff. Once more, however, you must look at your vision and your mission and the degree to which you want to be responsive to somebody that would object to a cabin counselor based on this issue. But I would encourage you to, once again, what if it were a different issue? If parents were expressing a concern about a cabin counselor's race or religion, how would you handle that in terms of responding to that parent? Because the fact of the matter is, your counselors have very specific duties that they need to adhere to and fulfill. It's not about the bodies they have in fulfilling those. And so I think, once again, you need to be very thoughtful about how you philosophically want to respond to people that have these kinds of concerns. And again, concerns or liability of young people with biologically female bodies sharing living spaces with adult biological men. Again, I understand the concern completely. If your concern is that you're worried about having transgender women being supervisors in that camp space, that's an important consideration for you to take on in a way similar to what we said above. You also need to look at what your state and local employment laws have to say about that, and to the degree to which you can or cannot limit somebody's ability to fulfill a position if it happens to be paid staff. But I want to encourage you once more, when those concerns are being raised, rather than focusing on the bodies, Focus on the concerns. Tell me more about why you're nervous about this situation. What do you imagine might occur if an individual such as this is going to be supervising that camp? What are you worried about, and how can we then maybe address that? That is a much more effective way than zeroing in on the who is in there, but instead focusing on what they need to accomplish and what the specific concerns that that family may have. If those concerns continue, this is an opportunity to look at, well, what other options do you have that involve that family and that camper perhaps adjusting, but not necessarily saying that the staff person must adjust simply because of the discomfort that one or more of the families may have. Once more, you have to balance a lot of issues with that kind of question. And I don't want to pretend that in every community the responses will be the same. You may be fearing that you'll have an entire population of campers decide to leave your camp, and you have to decide where that compromise is going to get made. But please do so intentionally. Do so from a place of gender literacy and knowledge about what gender is, what gender diversity is, and also being very, very cognizant that many of the fears that are being raised are based on a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. And if you're able to at least address those, you're helping create greater gender inclusion, even if you end up making decisions that don't necessarily respect or account for the gender of the staff or campers that you're trying to deal with. Before we look at resources, let's take a look at some of the questions that have come in and see if we've addressed some of those. Where do you fall on young staff who go on fishing expeditions with young campers with conversations that they, as a staff person, want to bring up to those campers? That's an interesting question. And if I understand that, what I believe is being asked is, what do you do in situations where a staff person is perhaps probing about a young person's gender? Well, once more, I would need to hear more specifically what we're talking about here, but to what extent have you put out expectations to your staff about exploring any aspects of who their campers are? What are the limits of appropriate kinds of inquiries versus maybe less appropriate ones? Are we talking about a staff person responding to a question that a young person asked, or are we talking about someone specifically pinpointing a student and asking them about their gender? One of the earlier questions was, what about initiating a gender support plan? Is it a problem? If you believe the gender of one of your campers is impacting their ability to be successful in your space, in your camp, then you have a responsibility to examine that and perhaps work with that camper and say, listen, we're observing some things and we just want to make sure we're supporting you. I know the fear can be like, if we raise this topic, we're somehow going to create a situation or encourage a situation. And I want to encourage you to consider that reaching out in a supportive way that says, I want to understand what's happening for you and how we can best support you, is what you're all about as camp staff anyway, which is meeting the needs of individual kids. Again, how do you recommend managing sleeping arrangements, overnight activities, and bathing, showering, changing procedures, etc.? Well, I think, we've addressed that, and a lot of this will come down to your specific context. It'll come down to some of the very specific accommodations that you have, the individual campers involved, but being very, very intentional and being very, very clear about your philosophies in the ways you communicate about the camp must be part of that. And that's why it's important to be having some of these conversations now as you consider how you want to handle some of these different situations. I'm sorry. You keep saying provide private areas for bathrooms, etc., but should they be required for our gender nonconforming campers to use? So let me be clear. We would strongly recommend they not be required. If you require your gender nonconforming or transgender campers to use specific designated spaces, you're placing a significant stigma on those campers. And I would encourage you to, again, think about what that would be like from the perspective of a camper, and to also consider times in our society when we forced other people who were different into spaces that were designated for them. This is a very serious thing to say to someone, that you must use a certain restroom or a certain space because I'm not comfortable with who you are. Now, it's completely different to say your conduct means you need to use a private space, but someone simply existing, somebody simply saying, this is who I am, I want to go pee, and then I want to go back to the activities, to force them to a different space, a stigmatized space, not only creates a great deal of discomfort for that person, it also in many ways puts a target on that kid's back, because it now says that the institution specifically does not respect that person's assertion of self. And if you can tell that kid to go to a special place to go to the bathroom, what's to say you can't call that kid certain names? What's to say you can't treat that young person in a way that's really, really different? Because come on, the camp is also saying that they're not as authentic as I am. And so you need to be very, very thoughtful about that. So again, let me be clear. We would strongly encourage you to avoid requiring anyone to use a private space, but making it an option for anyone who might need it or might want it, whether it's a transgender kid who may, or somebody who's uncomfortable with a transgender kid, in which case you can say, you know what? It sounds like you need some private accommodations because you're not comfortable with this situation. But to ask that young person who's transgender to accommodate the discomfort of another camper feels unfair. Let me see what else we have here. Okay, tent accommodations. How can we make tent arrangements for our students that doesn't out anyone by gender, but still prevents romantic relationships? Very, very diplomatic way of asking that question, one that we get quite often. So I would say the following. If you want to prevent any romantic relationships from happening, don't let kids be in camps. In tents, I'm sorry, don't let kids be in tents. Because regardless of the bodies, romantic relationships can occur if you allow kids in tents together. Make no mistake about that. It doesn't matter what the bodies are. What I do want to encourage you, though, to think about is, do they happen or not? And that they do or don't because of the setting you've created, the conditions and expectations around conduct. Just as we have certain rules about what campers might bring to camp or how they might conduct themselves in other spaces, they do or they don't because we set the conditions, we set the standards, we set the bar around how kids need to be conducting themselves. Just because people of two different bodies are sharing a tent does not mean that they are more or less likely to become physically active. What's going to be mattering in that situation is the ways in which you've communicated your expectations about any physical contact in those spaces. And that's a conversation I hope you're having with every one of your campers, if that's a priority that you want to take care of. And as a parent myself, I hope it is. But by the same token, simply having different bodies does not mean that kids will be romantic, and having the same bodies doesn't mean they won't. Let's see. If you have a staff member or guide who is non-binary or gender non-conforming, should you disclose this knowledge to your students before interacting with the guide? One may want their campers to be prepared and preloaded to use proper pronouns, use appropriate language, etc. However, one does not want to out or discuss the individual in an offensive or archaic manner. Well, let me just say a couple things about our neighbors and community members who are non-binary or gender non-conforming. In many cases, they themselves will be asserting, this is the pronoun I would like you to use, this is the way I would like to be referred to, perhaps this is the name I'm using. So in many cases, it's not going to be a matter of you revealing that, because the individual themselves may very well be presenting in such a way that's maybe androgynous or somehow non-binary. The first question to ask is the staff person. How do you want to handle working with the campers and families about your gender? This is important to decide up front rather than making assumptions. The camp staff person may very well say, listen, if it's okay, I would love to say at the beginning, my name is Joel. I use the pronouns they, them, and theirs, and I would like other people to please use that when talking about me. If anyone has a question about that, I'm happy to talk about it. Or they may very well say, you know what, if that could be written to the members of my group and their families as a way to communicate with me, that would be great. You need to give that staff person a great deal of control over how that information about them is being shared. To simply ask is such a respectful step. And I appreciate the question about trying to avoid offensive, archaic manners. My experience is with the vast majority of individuals navigating gender, if they're being asked in a sincere way, in a respectful way that says, hey, I don't quite get all this, but I want to make sure I'm being respectful. How can we best support you? That will almost always result in not only not being offensive, but being perceived as quite supportive. And even if your language is a little bit unsure, if you're stumbling over terminology, the fact that you're authentically inquiring and doing so in a way that says, we want to just get this right and be respectful, will go a long way. You need to work with that staff person to find out what makes the most sense for them as they work with their young people. I'm on board with everything you are saying. How do I convince the rest of the lead staff team that everything will be okay? Well, so I do want to encourage you as we move towards the end of our session here today. There are camps all over the country, all over the world, really, that are navigating these issues quite successfully by being proactive, by setting up conditions, by being very, very intentional in the way you're handling each of the many questions that have been raised today. You will handle this well. I think one of the ways to help get other people on board is to perhaps bring information about the experiences of transgender young people and other gender-expansive young people and the very difficult challenges they are experiencing in the world, and ask whether your space wants to be somewhere that doesn't repeat that kind of experience. In fact, a place where things can be safe. To give people the very lived experience of what your camp can be as a safe space is critical. To recognize that it's okay if you're uncomfortable with many of these ideas or if they're new to you, but please be committed to learning more, because much of that discomfort is often not grounded in being informed about the very issues that we're talking about. I think one of the most effective ways to bring your staff along is to connect these ideas to your mission and to the values of your organization and the kind of space that you're creating. That can be a very powerful way as well to help people make an informed choice. And you may have some staff people say to you, you know what, if this is the direction we're going, I'm not sure this is the right space for me. That might be okay. What I can also tell you is if you're making these kinds of commitments, word will also go out to a wide range of people who are very much excited to join an organization that's trying to be as respectful and inclusive as you would be. You mentioned that it's not about who is in the room, but how campers conduct themselves. Can you give examples, guidelines, conditions that you would provide students? Well, once again, this is about things like privacy, respecting boundaries, honoring the name that someone asks you to call them. I know, for instance, at camp, nicknames are huge. We certainly have kids using other names all the time, making it clear that campers decide for themselves what they'll be called. Making it very clear about how you undress, and do you undress in a way that, you know, is private and modest? Is it okay for you to be showing your body to other people? Just demonstrating expectations of what it means to be in a shared space like a cabin or a room or a tent with another person. This is not just an important skill if you happen to be rooming with somebody whose body is different than yours. It's an important skill for life. And as our young people move into spaces like college, working with, being with roommates or eventually living with other people, whatever the circumstances, having learned how to do that in a respectful way is something that's valuable for all of them. So I do want to begin to wrap up. One of the questions was, will we be sharing our slide deck? This, as I said, will be recorded, and so everything will be that we've shown will be on that recording. If there's a specific desire to use some of our slides for your own training, we would ask you to go ahead and contact us. And speaking of that, let's look at some of the resources that I mentioned, So once again, under the Gender Spectrum webpage, under resources, if you look in the parenting and family section, you'll see a lot of great stuff about camps, including the framework for gender inclusive camps, the support plan, an FAQ that we give to parents, but is a great guide for you as well, some articles from camping associations about this topic, and also some videos. I want to finish by saying, give yourself time to deepen your own knowledge and capacity about this topic. Much of this is new for many of us, and it takes time to bring in and understand these changing notions of gender and how they impact you. But I also want to encourage you to reflect on the ways in which you do this all the time by supporting the individual needs of your campers. This is not something new. It may be a new area, but you're doing this all the time. I also want to let you know that Gender Spectrum is here to work with you as you try to begin or continue this work, whether it's through training, through consultation. We would be honored to work with you as you work to become a more gender-inclusive space for your entire community. To contact us, please reach us at these contact points. And once again, on behalf of Gender Spectrum, I want to thank you for joining us today. We hope it's been helpful. The video will be posted on our YouTube as well as our website. And once again, thank you for joining us to learn about creating gender-inclusive camps.